Welcome to Life Stories. In today's tale, we journey through grief, redemption, and the unexpected connections that bind us all. It's a story of loss, a chance encounter, and the revelation of a hidden truth that changes everything. As we follow Alexander and his newfound bond with Ben, we discover the profound lessons about love, family, and the quiet healing that comes with understanding the past. Join us as we unfold this heartwarming story and reflect on the ways life's most meaningful moments often come when we least expect them. Please subscribe to start the story today. Alexander Grant was a man who seemed to have it all. Luxury cars, a sprawling estate in the suburbs of Dallas, and a fortune that could have secured several lifetimes. But none of that mattered the day he lost his son, Dylan. It wasn't just a loss, it was an overwhelming hole that nothing could fill. No matter how many zeros were in his bank account or how many rare paintings lined the walls of his mansion. It had been 5 years since the tragic accident. Alexander had tried to bury his pain beneath layers of work, high-end investments, and public appearances. On the outside, he looked as though he was handling it. But deep down, there was an emptiness, a constant gnawing that wouldn't go away. Every Sunday, without fail, Alexander visited Dylan's grave. It became his ritual, his way of holding onto the son he'd lost. The cemetery was quiet, with only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of birds filling the air. It was a peaceful place, a sanctuary where Alexander could be alone with his grief. The world didn't intrude here. In this small, secluded cemetery on the outskirts of Dallas, Alexander could allow himself to feel the weight of his loss. The weight that he had been too afraid to acknowledge in the rush of his busy life. One Sunday morning, with a bouquet of white lilies in his hand, Dylan's favorite flower, Alexander approached the familiar grave. But something was different. There, sitting cross-legged in front of the headstone, was a young boy. He couldn't have been older than 10. His clothes were tattered, worn beyond repair, and his face was smudged with dirt. His hair was matted and unkempt. A stark contrast to the neat surroundings of the cemetery. The boy looked out of place, like someone who had been living on the streets. Alexander stopped in his tracks. His heart raced, not just from the surprise of seeing a child in a place so sacred to him, but from the uneasy feeling that began to rise in his chest. Who was this boy, and why was he sitting there? The cemetery wasn't a public place, it was private, and visitors were rare. Was he lost? Or worse, was he here for some other reason? The moment felt surreal. With a tight grip on the bouquet, Alexander cleared his throat and called out to the boy. His voice sharp but filled with curiosity. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" The boy's wide eyes locked with his. There was fear in them, but also a defiance, a quiet strength. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Alexander, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, felt a deep sense of powerlessness in that gaze. The boy was small, fragile even, but there was something about the way he held himself that suggested resilience beyond his years. Without a word, the boy jumped to his feet and bolted. He ran toward the dense woods bordering the cemetery, disappearing into the trees before Alexander could make sense of what had just happened. Stunned, Alexander stood frozen, the bouquet of lilies slipping from his hand. He reached for the flowers, taking a step forward, but the boy was already gone. A surge of questions flooded his mind. Who was he? Why had he been at Dylan's grave? And why had he run away so suddenly? The encounter rattled him. That night, he lay awake in bed, the image of the boy haunting him. His dirty clothes, the wild look in his eyes, and that sense of familiarity that Alexander couldn't quite place. There was something about him. It felt personal. Almost like he had seen that face before. But where? When? Unable to shake off the feeling, Alexander made a decision. He needed answers. The next morning, after a sleepless night, he called his private investigator, Michael. Michael had been working with him for years, handling business matters, and occasionally looking into personal things that needed discretion. He was a man of few words, efficient and thorough. Alexander explained the situation in a voice that was tight with both anger and confusion. "I need you to find someone for me," Alexander said. "A boy, around 10 years old. He was at my son's grave yesterday. Find out who he is and where he came from." Michael didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and got to work. The days that followed were a blur of impatience for Alexander. His usual business meetings lost their significance. His mind was consumed by the boy, his appearance, his silence, his sudden disappearance. The questions gnawed at him, distracting him from everything else. Why had this child been at Dylan's grave? What connection could he possibly have to his son? After what felt like an eternity, Michael called with an update. Alexander listened intently as Michael spoke. I found him, Michael said. The boy's name is Ben. He's been living on the streets with his mother, Emily. They've been moving from place to place, trying to stay under the radar. From what I've gathered, Ben has been visiting the cemetery regularly. He's been doing it for months. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. This was no coincidence. Where are they now? Alexander asked, his voice urgent. They're staying in an abandoned warehouse on the east side of Dallas. Michael replied, it's not a safe place. Alexander, if you want to meet them, I'd advise caution. Without hesitation, Alexander grabbed his coat and left for the warehouse. His mind raced with questions. Why had Ben been visiting Dylan's grave? What was the connection? And why had Emily kept them hidden for so long? As he drove through the streets of Dallas, the world outside seemed distant, as though nothing mattered except finding the answers. Little did he know, this journey would change everything. The drive to the east side of Dallas felt longer than it actually was. The streets grew quieter as Alexander's car ventured into the more rundown neighborhoods. The once stylish suburbs gave way to dilapidated buildings, broken streetlights, and graffiti-covered walls. The city seemed to exhale, the air heavy with an underlying tension that Alexander couldn't shake. As he neared the address Michael had given him, he noticed the warehouse looming in the distance. It was an imposing structure, abandoned for years, with rusted metal beams and cracked windows. Its isolation seemed to reflect its purpose, a place where things and people were discarded, left to fade into obscurity. Alexander parked his car at a distance, just out of view of the warehouse. He wanted to approach quietly, to avoid any unnecessary attention. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing against his chest. What was he about to uncover? With steady steps, he made his way through the cracked pavement and tall weeds, the warehouse standing like a dark sentinel. The entrance was hidden behind a chain-link fence, its gate barely hanging on its hinges. As he pushed the gate open with a groan, the sound echoed through the silence, almost as though the building was protesting his intrusion. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, with only shafts of sunlight breaking through the grime-covered windows. Dust swirled in the air, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of something shifting in the shadows. Alexander's footsteps echoed in the vast space as he moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the area. He had no idea what to expect, but a part of him was already bracing for something he couldn't fully understand. The boy, Ben, had clearly been here before, but what was he doing in a place like this? Just as he was about to turn a corner, a voice called out from the darkness. Who are you? Alexander froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned toward the voice and saw a woman emerge from behind a stack of old crates. She was thin, her clothes torn and worn, and her face was drawn with years of hardship. But there was a quiet strength in her eyes, an unspoken resilience that reminded him of something, someone, but he couldn't place it. Are you Emily? Alexander asked, his voice steady but guarded. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. Who are you? What do you want? I'm looking for Ben, he replied, his voice softer this time. He's been visiting my son's grave. I need to know why. Emily's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of fear. She stepped forward, her body tense, as though she was ready to flee. What do you know about my son? She demanded. Alexander felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He hadn't meant to sound accusatory, but he understood the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about a boy visiting a grave, it was about something much deeper. He took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of calm. I don't know much, he admitted, but I know Ben has been going to the cemetery. I need to understand why. If you trust me, I can help. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to discern the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but tinged with an emotion Alexander couldn't quite place. Ben doesn't have anyone else, she said, her voice breaking. He's been carrying something for a long time. Something heavy. And I don't know how to help him. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them settling in Alexander's chest. He wasn't just here to solve a mystery. He was here to help someone who was struggling with something much bigger than either of them understood. Before he could respond, a small figure emerged from the shadows. Ben. His face was familiar from the fleeting glimpse Alexander had caught at the cemetery. But now he looked different. Less wild, less fearful, but there was still a sadness in his eyes. A depth that no child should carry. Ben's gaze locked with Alexander's, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unasked questions and unspoken understanding. Alexander's heart twisted in his chest. This boy, this child, was somehow tied to his son, Dylan, and Alexander couldn't yet comprehend how or why. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice small and hesitant. I've been looking for him. For my dad. The words were like a punch to Alexander's gut. His heart skipped. Your dad? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben nodded, his small frame shivering slightly despite the warmth of the warehouse. I think he's there. In the cemetery. He's there, isn't he? I saw him in my dreams. Alexander's mind spun. He had been right. There was a connection between Ben and Dylan. But it wasn't just a casual one. Ben thought his father was at the cemetery. And he was searching for him. Hoping to find him again. You're looking for your father at my son's grave? Alexander asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Ben's eyes brightened with a quiet hope. A hope so pure that it almost broke Alexander's heart. I think my dad is there. And your son, he might know him. I need to find him. So he can tell me where my dad is. The room seemed to tilt. And for a moment, Alexander wasn't sure if he was awake or caught in some surreal dream. His son had been gone for years. Yet here was this boy, clinging to the hope that Dylan might somehow be the key to finding his own father. It was all too much to process in one moment. But Alexander knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away now. Whatever this was, it was far more significant than anything he could have imagined. Alexander felt a chill creep down his spine as he stared at Ben. The boy's eyes, filled with innocence and a desperate kind of hope, pierced through him like a ray of light through a storm. For a moment, the warehouse, with its peeling walls and thick dust, felt like a distant memory. Everything, every sound, every thought, faded away, leaving only Ben's fragile plea for help. I think my dad is there. Ben repeated softly, his voice trembling slightly. In the cemetery, with your son. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Alexander had been prepared for many things in life. But this was something he had never expected. A connection so deep, so inexplicable, between his son Dylan and a boy he had never met. It felt like the universe had unfolded a secret he wasn't ready to uncover. Ben stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Alexander's. His tiny fingers clutched the hem of his tattered shirt, as though holding onto something intangible, his hopes, his dreams, or perhaps the remnants of a love lost. Emily, who had been silently observing the exchange, now stepped forward. Her face, usually so guarded, was cracked open with raw emotion. There was pain in her eyes, but also an unspoken understanding. As though she, too, knew the truth of what was happening, though it was a truth neither of them was prepared to face. What are you saying, Ben? Alexander asked, his voice gentle but firm. You think Dylan's grave holds answers for you? Ben nodded, his small face set with determination. I don't know how, but I've seen it, in my dreams. My dad, I think he's waiting there. He's calling me, but I don't know what to do. A tight knot formed in Alexander's throat. This boy had been living with such a profound longing. A hunger to be reunited with his father that it consumed him. And yet, there was more to this than just dreams and wishes. Alexander could feel it in the air. The weight of something bigger than either of them. Ben, Emily said softly, her voice cracked with the burden of untold stories. You've been seeing things, haven't you? You're not imagining it. Your dad, he's been with you all along. Alexander's heart beat faster. Emily's words hinted at something deeper. Something he had yet to grasp. He looked between her and Ben, trying to make sense of it all. What do you mean? He asked, his mind racing. Is there something more to this? Something I don't know? Emily glanced at Ben, and for a moment, her expression softened, as if deciding whether or not to share what she knew. Then, she looked back at Alexander. Ben's father. He's gone, Alexander. But the connection between him and your son, Dylan, it's not just a coincidence. Alexander took a step back, reeling from her words. What are you saying? He whispered. That Dylan, he knew Ben's father? Yes, Emily said quietly, the truth spilling out in pieces, each one more difficult to digest than the last. Dylan and Ben's father were connected long before they passed. They were friends, close friends. They shared something that neither of them could explain, something that tied them together even after death. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alexander's mind scrambled to make sense of it all. His son, Dylan, had passed away years ago, and the grief of losing him still lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. But now, with these new revelations, it felt as though the earth beneath him was shifting, that the foundation of everything he thought he knew was cracking wide open. Dylan and Ben's father were close? Alexander repeated, his voice breaking. But I never heard about this. I never. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. No one knew. Not really. They made sure to keep their connection hidden. It was complicated, Alexander. More complicated than you can imagine. Ben's small voice cut through the tension. But my dad told me about Dylan. He said he would come back to help me. The words struck Alexander like a hammer. The final piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. Come back to help you? He repeated, his mind racing. What do you mean? How? Ben looked up at him, his eyes wide with unspoken wisdom. I don't know yet, but I'll find out. I have to. A shiver ran through Alexander. Not from the cold, but from the magnitude of what was unfolding before him. A child, this child, was carrying the weight of something immense. Something that could unravel everything he had believed about the world, about grief, and about the connections that linger even after death. Emily's voice broke the silence. Ben's father, he never got the chance to explain it to him. But he left behind something for him, something that will help him understand. Something that will give him the strength he needs to carry on. Alexander swallowed hard. What is it? What did Ben's father leave? Emily met his gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow and resolve. A letter. A message. It's buried with your son, Alexander. It's meant for Ben. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had become untrustworthy. The connection between Dylan and Ben's father ran far deeper than he had ever imagined. And now, it seemed, he was entangled in a story far bigger than himself. Why didn't you tell me this before? Alexander demanded, the anger rising in his chest. Why keep it a secret? I didn't know how, Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And I didn't want to drag you into something that wasn't yours to understand. But now, it's too late. You're already a part of it. Alexander stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her words. He had been living in the aftermath of Dylan's death, haunted by his memories, his regrets, and his hopes for what could have been. But now, as the pieces began to fall into place, he realized that his son's life, and death, was far more intertwined with Ben's journey than he had ever imagined. And that journey was just beginning. As the years passed, Alexander and Ben's bond grew stronger. The letter, once buried deep beneath the soil, had been found, its words fragile, yet full of wisdom and love. Dylan's spirit, though gone from this world, had transcended into something far more profound than Alexander could have imagined. He had helped guide Ben, just as he had promised, even from beyond the grave, and in that guidance, they both found healing. Ben, once a boy lost in his grief, now carried himself with a quiet confidence, his eyes no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a peace that came from knowing he was never truly alone. Alexander, too, had found a kind of redemption, He had spent years running from his sorrow. But now, standing beside Ben, he understood that grief was not something to escape, it was something to embrace, to learn from, and to honor. Together, they had uncovered the threads that connected their families. And in doing so, they had discovered the most powerful lesson of all, that love never truly dies. It shifts, it transforms, but it remains. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. Life, with all its pain and beauty, was never just about the moments we lost. It was about the ones we still had, and the people who would walk beside us through it all. And so, with a heart finally at rest, Alexander whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Dylan," the boy who had taught him everything about love, loss, and the power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to stay updated with more life stories.